The dust kicked up from the auction block settled like a shroud over the small frontier town of Willow Creek. It was a Tuesday in September, and the air carried the scent of dying leaves and desperation. Men in worn hats and dusty boots gathered around the makeshift platform, their eyes cold and calculating as they examined the human merchandise being paraded before them. Clara Whitman stood on that wooden platform with her chin held high, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. Her dress, once a fine blue cotton, now hung in tatters from weeks of travel and hardship. Her auburn hair, normally pinned in a neat bun, had escaped its confines and fell in tangled waves around her shoulders. But it was her eyes that drew attention, green as prairie grass and filled with a defiance that hadn't been broken despite everything she'd endured. The auctioneer, a thin man with yellowed teeth and a voice like gravel, called out to the crowd. "Here we have a fine specimen, gentlemen. Young, strong, can read and write, perfect for housekeeping," or he let the implication hang in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Clara's stomach churned, but she kept her gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the crowd. She thought of her father's farm back in Missouri, of the morning he'd died and left her alone with debts she couldn't pay. The bank had taken everything, and she'd made the desperate decision to head west, seeking work as a teacher or governess. But the wagon train had been attacked by bandits, and she'd been captured, sold from hand to hand until she'd ended up here, in this dusty hellhole where human beings were traded like cattle. "What am I bid for this one?" the auctioneer shouted, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd like a death knell. $2, called out a man in a stained apron, probably the local saloon keeper. His eyes roamed over Clara's form with an hunger that made her skin crawl. $3, countered another, this one wearing a sheriff's badge that looked as tarnished as his soul. The way he smiled at Clara made her want to wrap her arms around herself for protection. Clara closed her eyes and reached out in her heart to a strength she no longer believed in. She thought of her mother's old Bible, lost somewhere along the trail, and the verses about dignity and worth that now felt like nothing more than stories. The jeers and crude remarks from the crowd crashed over her like a wave of filth, but she forced herself to stand tall, clinging to the last shred of dignity she still had. $5, came a voice from the back of the crowd, quiet but clear as a bell cutting through the noise. The crowd turned to look at the speaker, and Clara's eyes followed. A tall man stepped forward, his hat pulled low over his face. He wore simple clothes, denim pants worn soft with age, a cotton shirt that had seen better days, and boots that had walked many miles. But there was something about the way he carried himself, a quiet strength that made the other men step aside as he approached the platform. $5 going once, the auctioneer called, clearly disappointed by the low bids. He'd probably expected more for a young woman who could read and write, who still had some fight left in her. Going twice, the auctioneer continued, scanning the crowd for higher offers that never came. Clara found herself looking at the stranger, trying to read his face beneath the shadow of his hat brim. He looked up then, meeting her gaze directly, and their eyes locked. His were brown, the color of rich earth after rain, and in them she saw something she hadn't seen in weeks: kindness. Not pity, not lust, not calculation, but simple human kindness. Sold to the gentleman for $5. The word sold hit Clara like a physical blow. $5. That's all she was worth now. $5 for a life, for dreams, for everything she'd once been and hoped to be. She'd seen horses sell for more at the stockyards back home. Tears she'd been holding back for weeks finally spilled down her cheeks, not from sadness but from a rage so deep it threatened to consume her. The stranger, her new owner, she thought bitterly, approached the platform with measured steps. He was older than she'd first thought, maybe 35, with weathered hands that spoke of hard work and lines around his eyes that came from squinting into prairie sun. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, white against his tanned skin, but it didn't make him look cruel, just tired and worn by whatever battles he'd fought. "Mom," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect that seemed almost surreal given the circumstances. His voice was gentle, with a slight drawl that spoke of Texas or maybe Arkansas. "My name's Jake Morrison. I know this ain't how anybody should be treated, and I'm sorry for that." Clara stared at him, unsure whether to feel grateful or furious. After weeks of being treated like property, like something less than human, his politeness felt almost mocking. "Are you going to tell me what you expect from me, Mr. Morrison?" Jake looked around at the dispersing crowd, at the men who were already moving on to examine other human merchandise, then back at her. Right now, I expect you might be hungry. There's a decent place to eat across the street, if you'd care to join me. The simple offer of food, spoken without demand or expectation, nearly undid her. When was the last time someone had asked instead of commanded? When had anyone cared whether she was hungry or tired or afraid? Ah, yes. Thank you. He helped her down from the platform with surprising gentleness, offering his arm for support rather than grabbing or manhandling her. As they walked across the dusty street, Clara couldn't help but notice how other men looked at Jake with a mixture of respect and wariness. Whoever he was, he had a reputation in this town, and it wasn't one to be taken lightly. The restaurant was small and clean, with checkered tablecloths and the smell of fresh bread wafting from the kitchen. Jake chose a table in the back corner, away from the windows and the curious stares of other patrons, and pulled out a chair for Clara. She sat carefully, acutely aware of her torn dress and tangled hair, feeling out of place in even this simple establishment. "Order whatever you like," Jake said, settling across from her and removing his hat to reveal thick brown hair, touched with early gray. "I imagine it's been a while since you had a proper meal." Clara's stomach growled at the mention of food, betraying her hunger despite her attempts to maintain some dignity. She ordered soup and bread, coffee and a piece of apple pie, and when the food arrived, she found herself eating with an urgency that embarrassed her. Jake ate slowly, watching her with those brown eyes that seemed to see too much. "Where are you from?" he asked when she'd taken the edge off her hunger. "Missouri. My father had a farm there." The words came out clipped, defensive. She wasn't ready to tell her story to this stranger, no matter how kind he seemed. Good farming country. Rich soil, decent rainfall. What brought you west? Clara set down her spoon, meeting his gaze directly. The kindness in his eyes was almost harder to bear than cruelty would have been. "Mr. Morrison, let's not pretend this is a social call. You bought me for $5. The least you can do is tell me what you expect in return instead of making small talk." Jake was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. The silence stretched between them, filled with the low murmur of other conversations and the clink of dishes from the kitchen. Finally, he spoke. "Fair enough. I own a ranch about 10 miles north of here. It's not much, a few hundred head of cattle, some horses, a house that needs work. I've been running it alone since my partner died last year, and it's more than one man can handle properly. And you think I can help with ranch work?" Clara couldn't keep the skepticism out of her voice. She was educated, refined, raised to be a teacher or perhaps a preacher's wife, not a ranch hand. "I think you can do whatever you set your mind to," Jake said simply. "But that's not why I bought you." He leaned forward, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "Miss, I've seen enough of this world to know that sometimes good people end up in bad situations through no fault of their own. What happened to you back there? That auction, that ain't right. Nobody should be bought and sold like livestock. Then why did you participate in it?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended, edged with all the anger and humiliation she'd been holding inside. "Because if I hadn't, you'd have gone to one of them other men, and I seen the look in their eyes." Jake's jaw tightened, and for a moment Clara glimpsed the steel beneath his gentle exterior. "Trust me when I say, $5 was the best money I ever spent if it kept you from that fate." Clara felt tears threatening again, but she blinked them back. She'd cried enough these past weeks to last a lifetime. "So what happens now? You've paid for me, Mr. Morrison. In the eyes of the law, you own me just like you'd own a horse or a cow. No, miss. Maybe in the eyes of the law you were owned, but in my eyes, you're a free woman who's just had a rough time." Jake's voice was steady and sure. "You can stay at my ranch as long as you like, work if you want to, leave whenever you're ready. All I ask is that you give yourself a little time to figure out what you want next." The words washed over Clara like cool water after a drought. Freedom. When was the last time that word had meant anything to her? Why would you do this for a stranger? What's in it for you? Jake was quiet for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, thick with old pain. "I had a sister once, Sarah. She was about your age when some men took her from our family's farm back in Texas. Claimed she owed them money for her husband's gambling debts." He looked up, and Clara saw pain in his eyes that matched her own. "We never saw her again. Never knew what became of her. I couldn't save Sarah. But maybe I can help you." The ride to Jake's ranch took them through some of the most beautiful country Clara had ever seen. Rolling hills covered in prairie grass stretched to the horizon, broken by groves of cottonwood trees along creek beds that sparkled in the afternoon sun. The air was clean and sweet, filled with the scent of sage and wildflowers, and despite everything she'd been through, Clara felt something inside her chest loosen for the first time in months. Jake rode beside her on a gentle mare he'd procured from the town's livery stable, pointing out landmarks and telling her about the land. He spoke of weather patterns and water sources, of the best places to graze cattle, and where the wolves liked to den in winter. It was clear he loved this country with the passion of a man who'd found his place in the world, who understood that the land could heal as well as harm. "There she is," Jake said as they crested a low hill as the sun began to sink toward the western horizon. "Home." Clara looked down at the ranch spread out below them and felt her breath catch. It wasn't grand, just a simple log house with a wide front porch, a substantial barn, several corrals, and a few outbuildings scattered around a natural clearing. But it was well maintained and peaceful, nestled in a valley with a clear stream running nearby. Smoke curled from the chimney, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance, dark shapes against the golden grass. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. After the squalor and desperation of recent weeks, the sight of this peaceful homestead seemed like something from a dream. "It'll do," Jake replied, but she could hear the pride in his voice, the deep satisfaction of a man who'd built something lasting with his own hands. As they rode down the hill, Clara found herself actually looking forward to seeing the inside of the house. After weeks of sleeping rough and living in constant fear, the prospect of a real bed and 4 solid walls around her seemed like the height of luxury. The setting sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber, and for the first time since her father's death, Clara felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. The house was simple but comfortable, with handmade furniture that showed the care of its maker and floors so clean they gleamed in the lamplight. Jake showed her to a small room at the back of the house, explaining that it had been his partner's room before consumption took him the previous winter. "Will was a good man," Jake said, running his hand along the door frame with obvious affection. "Saved my life more than once, taught me most of what I know about ranching. You'll find some of his clothes in the chest there. They might be too big, but they're clean and mended. There's a wash basin on the stand, and I'll bring you some hot water from the kitchen so you can clean up proper." Clara looked around the room, at the simple bed with its carefully made patchwork quilt, the wooden chest carved with intricate designs, the small window that looked out over the valley. It was more than she'd dared hope for, a sanctuary where she might begin to heal from the wounds of recent weeks. "Mr. Morrison," she began, but he held up a hand. "Just Jake, miss. And you don't need to thank me. Just rest. You've been through enough to break most people, but you're still standing. That tells me you're stronger than you know." That night, Clara lay in the narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling around her. Cattle lowing in the distance, the hoot of an owl hunting in the darkness, the creak of wood cooling in the night air. For the first time in months, she felt truly safe, but with safety came the luxury of reflection, and with reflection came pain. She thought of her father, dead of a fever that might have been cured if they'd had money for a proper doctor. She thought of their small farm, now owned by strangers who would never love it as her family had. She thought of her dreams of becoming a teacher, of having a classroom full of eager students, of making a difference in the world. All of it seemed impossibly far away now, as distant as the stars visible through her small window. But she also thought of Jake Morrison, of the unexpected kindness in his eyes and the gentleness in his voice when he'd spoken of his lost sister. She thought of Sarah, disappeared into the darkness that swallowed so many women on the frontier, and wondered if helping Clara was Jake's way of fighting back against a cruelty he couldn't defeat. The next morning, Clara woke to the smell of coffee and bacon drifting through the house. She dressed in some of Will's old clothes. They were indeed too big, but they were clean and practical, and it felt good to be covered properly again. She made her way to the kitchen, where Jake was at the stove, cooking breakfast with the easy competence of a man who'd been taking care of himself for a long time. "Morning," he said without turning around, as if they'd been sharing breakfast for years instead of having just met. "Coffee's on the table. Breakfast'll be ready in a minute." Clara poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the rough wooden table. The kitchen was warm and inviting, with dried herbs hanging from the rafters and morning sunlight streaming through windows so clean they sparkled. It felt like a home, not just a house, and she realized how long it had been since she'd experienced that particular comfort. "Jake," she said after they'd eaten in comfortable silence, watching him through the steam rising from her coffee cup. "I want to work. I need to contribute somehow." Jake studied her face, his brown eyes serious. "You don't owe me anything, Clara. You can take all the time you need to decide what you want to do with your life. I've decided. I want to help with the ranch. I may not know much about cattle or horses, but I can learn. I can cook, clean, mend clothes, tend a garden. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I won't be a burden." Something shifted in Jake's expression, respect, maybe, or recognition of a kindred spirit. "All right then, but we do this as partners, not as owner and property. You work because you choose to, and you take a fair share of whatever profits we make. This is a business arrangement between equals." Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion. Partnership, equality. When was the last time anyone had offered her that kind of respect? "I'd like that very much." And so began the strangest and most healing period of Clara's life. Jake proved to be a patient teacher, showing her how to read the moods of cattle, how to mend fences that would hold against winter storms, how to tell when a horse was favoring one leg or developing the early signs of illness. She learned to ride properly. Not the side saddle style of her refined upbringing, but the practical astride method that let her work effectively. She learned to throw a lasso, to identify the signs of predators, to read weather patterns in the movement of clouds across the endless sky. In return, she transformed the ranch house. She planted a garden, coaxing vegetables and flowers from the rich soil. She established routines of cleaning and cooking that brought order to Jake's previously haphazard bachelor existence. She mended clothes that had been patched and re-patched, organized supplies with the efficiency of someone who understood the value of preparedness, and even convinced Jake to let her paint the inside walls of the house with whitewash that made everything brighter. The work was hard, harder than anything she'd done in her previous life, but it was honest work done by choice, and that made all the difference. Clara felt her body growing stronger, her hands becoming calloused and capable. More importantly, she felt her spirit healing. The nightmares came less frequently, and she began to sleep through the night without starting awake in terror. Jake was a good companion, steady, reliable, with a dry sense of humor that caught Clara off guard sometimes and made her laugh despite herself. He never pushed her to talk about her past, never made her feel like she owed him gratitude beyond the work they'd agreed to share. Slowly, carefully, they built a friendship based on mutual respect and shared labor. But it was more than friendship, Clara realized one evening as she watched Jake working with an injured horse. There was a gentleness in the way he handled the frightened animal, a patience that spoke to something deep in Clara's heart. She found herself noticing the way his hands moved as he worked, the concentration on his face when he was solving a problem, the way he spoke softly to calm the fears of any creature in distress. She was falling in love with Jake Morrison, and that terrified her more than anything she'd faced on the long trail west. The realization came at the worst possible moment. Winter was approaching, and they'd been working long days to prepare the ranch for the months of cold and snow ahead. Clara had been helping Jake repair the barn roof when she slipped on a wet board and fell, twisting her ankle badly enough that she couldn't put weight on it. Jake carried her to the house, his face tight with worry, and settled her on the sofa with her foot elevated on pillows. As he knelt beside her, checking the swelling and trying to determine if the ankle was broken, Clara found herself studying his face, the concentration in his brown eyes, the gentleness of his touch despite his calloused hands, the way his hair fell across his forehead when he was focused on something important. "I don't think it's broken," he said, looking up at her with relief clear in his expression. "But you'll need to stay off it for a few days. Let the swelling go down." Their faces were very close, and Clara could see the exact moment when Jake became aware of it too. Something shifted in his expression, a softening that made her heart race, and she saw her own feelings reflected in his eyes. For a heartbeat, she thought he might kiss her, and she realized she'd wanted him to more than she'd wanted anything in a very long time. Instead, he pulled back, his face closing off like shutters slamming shut. "I'll get you some ice from the creek," he said, his voice carefully neutral, professionally distant. That night, Clara lay awake thinking about the moment by the sofa and Jake's retreat from it. She understood his hesitation. How could he be sure her feelings were real and not just gratitude? How could she be sure herself? The line between thankfulness and love could be thin, especially for someone who'd been through trauma that might make her cling to the first man who showed her genuine kindness. But as the days passed and her ankle healed, Clara found herself more certain, not less. She loved Jake's quiet strength, his dry humor, the way he treated every living thing with respect and compassion. She loved working beside him, the comfortable silences they shared, the way he made her feel safe without making her feel helpless or diminished. She loved the man he was, not just what he'd done for her. The problem was convincing Jake that her feelings were real and not born of circumstance. The opportunity came in late October, when an early snowstorm caught them by surprise. They were moving the cattle to winter pasture when the sky opened up, dumping wet snow that quickly became a complete whiteout. Clara and Jake found themselves separated from the herd, taking shelter in a line shack miles from the main ranch. The shack was basic, just 4 walls, a stone fireplace, and a few emergency supplies. But it was warm and dry once Jake got a fire going, and after hours of fighting the storm, it felt almost cozy. They waited out the blizzard, playing cards with a deck Jake found in the supplies and talking about everything and nothing, and as night fell, Clara realized they'd have to spend the night there together. "I'll sleep on the floor," Jake said, as if reading her thoughts. "You take the bunk, Jake," Clara said, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "We need to talk." Something in her tone made him look up from the fire he'd been poking unnecessarily. "About what?" "About us. About what's happening between us, what's been happening for weeks now." Jake's face went carefully blank. The expression she'd learned meant he was protecting himself from something painful. "Clara, I don't want you to feel like—" "Stop," she interrupted, standing up despite her recently healed ankle. "Just stop and listen to me for once. I know what you're thinking. You think I'm grateful, confused, maybe even suffering from some kind of affliction that makes me think I care about you when I really don't. But you're wrong." She moved closer to where he sat by the fire, noting how he tensed as she approached. "I've been thinking about this for weeks, Jake. Examining my feelings, questioning them, testing them against every doubt I can imagine. And here's what I know. I love you. Not because you saved me, not because you gave me a home, but because of who you are." Jake stared up at her, his face a mix of hope and uncertainty and something that might have been fear. "Clara, you've been through so much trauma. How can you be sure what you're feeling is real and not just—" "Because I know the difference between gratitude and love," she said firmly, kneeling down beside his chair so they were at eye level. "I'm grateful to you, yes. I'd be grateful to anyone who helped me in my darkest hour. But what I feel for you goes deeper than that, Jake. I love the way you gentle a frightened horse with nothing but patience and soft words. I love your terrible cooking and the way you hum old songs when you think no one's listening. I love that you see the best in people and that you've never once made me feel like damaged goods." She took his hands in hers, feeling the calluses earned through honest work, the strength that had never been used to hurt her. "I know you have feelings for me too. I see it in the way you look at me sometimes, hear it in your voice when you say my name. The question is, are you brave enough to trust that what we have is real?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying their joined hands as if they held the answer to life's great mysteries. When he looked up, Clara saw tears in his eyes, and her heart clenched with tenderness for this strong man who'd been hurt so badly he was afraid to hope for happiness. "I lost everyone I ever cared about, Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "My parents to a fever, my sister to men who saw her as property, my partner Will to a disease that ate him alive from the inside. I don't know if I'm strong enough to survive losing you too." "You won't lose me," Clara said fiercely, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "I'm not going anywhere. Jake Morrison. I've spent months searching for a place to belong and I've found it. My home isn't this ranch or this valley or even this territory. My home is you." This time, when Jake reached for her, he didn't pull back. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, full of questions and promises and hope. Clara felt something inside her chest unfurl like a flower opening to the sun after a long winter. This was what she'd been searching for without even knowing it. Not just safety or shelter, but a true partner, someone who saw her as she really was and loved her for it. They spent that snowy night talking by the fire, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for their future. Jake told her about growing up in Texas, about his parents' small ranch and how he'd learned to love the land and everything that lived on it. He talked about his sister Sarah, about the guilt he carried for not being able to protect her, about the way that guilt had driven him west in search of something he couldn't name, but had found in Clara. Clara told him about her father, about their little farm in Missouri and the dreams she'd harbored of teaching school and making a difference in the world. She talked about the wagon train attack, about the weeks of captivity and fear that followed, about standing on that auction block and thinking her life was over, not knowing it was actually just beginning. But it wasn't over, Jake said, stroking her hair as she lay with her head on his shoulder, watching the fire burn down to embers. It was just beginning. Yes, Clara agreed, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones like warmth from the fire. It was just beginning. The storm passed by morning, leaving the world transformed and sparkling white under a brilliant blue sky. They found the cattle safe in a sheltered valley and drove them to winter pasture without further incident. But something fundamental had changed between Clara and Jake. They moved together now with the easy synchronization of true partners, finishing each other's sentences, anticipating each other's needs, working as a team in everything they did. That winter was the happiest of Clara's life. She and Jake worked together during the short daylight hours, maintaining the ranch and caring for the animals that depended on them. In the evenings, they sat by the fire reading books from Jake's small library, talking about their plans for the future, simply enjoying each other's company. They were married by a traveling preacher in December, with their only witnesses being the ranch hands Jake had hired for the winter months. Spring brought new challenges and new joys. Clara discovered she was pregnant, and Jake's reaction was so pure and overwhelming that it brought tears to her eyes. They worked together to expand the house, adding a room for the baby and making other improvements. The ranch prospered under their joint management, and by summer they were able to buy additional land and expand their herd significantly. Their daughter was born in September, exactly a year after Clara had stood on that auction block in Willow Creek. They named her Sarah Hope Morrison, Sarah for Jake's lost sister, hope for the future they were building together. As Clara held her newborn daughter and looked into Jake's eyes, she thought about the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect happiness. The years that followed brought their share of hardships, droughts that tested their resolve, harsh winters that claimed livestock, cattle rustlers who had to be dealt with firmly, and the occasional bout of illness that reminded them how precious and fragile life could be. But they faced everything together, their love growing stronger with each challenge overcome. They had 4 more children, expanded the ranch into one of the most successful operations in the territory, and became pillars of the growing community around Willow Creek. Clara never forgot where she'd come from, and she made sure her children knew the story too, not to dwell on the pain and humiliation, but to understand the value of compassion, the importance of seeing the worth in every human being regardless of their circumstances. She and Jake established a fund to help other women in desperate situations, and their ranch became known as a place where someone in trouble could find help, safety, and a chance to start over. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Jake surprised Clara with a trip back to Willow Creek. The town had grown and prospered over the years. The old auction block long since torn down and replaced with a small park where children played and families gathered for community events. They stood together in the town square where Clara had once stood alone and afraid, and Jake took her hand just as he had all those years ago. "Any regrets?" he asked, smiling at her with eyes that still held all the love and tenderness they'd had on their wedding day. Clara looked around at the peaceful town square, then at her husband's face. Still handsome after all these years, marked now with lines of laughter and the wisdom that came from a life well lived. She thought of their children, grown now with families of their own, of the ranch they'd built together from nothing but hope and hard work, of the hundreds of people they'd helped over the years, of the love story that had grown from the darkest moment of her life. "Just one," she said, and Jake's smile faltered slightly. "I regret that it took me so long to find you." Jake laughed, the sound carrying across the square like music, like joy made audible. "Well, darling, some things are worth waiting for." "Yes," Clara agreed, standing on her tiptoes to kiss the man who'd seen her worth when the world had valued her at only $5. Some things are worth everything. As they walked away from the place where their story had begun, Clara reflected on the strange and wonderful paths life could take. She'd lost everything: family, home, freedom, dignity, only to find something infinitely more precious. Love had transformed them both, had taken two broken people and made them whole, had built something beautiful from the ashes of despair. That night, in their hotel room, Clara lay in Jake's arms and listened to his steady breathing, the sound that had comforted her through 25 years of marriage. Tomorrow they would head home to their ranch, to their family, to the life they'd built together from nothing but hope and determination and love. It had all started with $5 and a man brave enough to see value where others saw only commodity, wise enough to recognize that some things couldn't be measured in money. Sometimes, Clara thought as she drifted off to sleep, the best investments were made not with the head, but with the heart. Jake had gambled $5 on a stranger's future, and that gamble had paid dividends beyond anything either of them could have imagined. In a world that often measured worth in dollars and cents, they'd discovered that some things, love, dignity, hope, the chance to start over, were truly priceless. The wind outside their window carried the scent of sage and possibility, and Clara smiled as she fell asleep, grateful for auction blocks and unlikely rescues, for second chances and the cowboy who'd seen her true worth when it mattered most. In the morning they would return to their ranch, to the life they'd built from $5 and a dream. But tonight, Clara held close the memory of that desperate day in Willow Creek, when she'd thought her story was ending. Not knowing it was just the first page of the most beautiful chapter of her life. She'd been worth only $5 to a crowd of strangers, but to Jake Morrison, she'd been worth everything, and that had made all the difference in the world.